All right, we're going to do our 5-minute evangelism class. Today we're going to talk about what's called 4 generations. You know, we have 4 generations in our family now. We have me and Ruth, and then our children, and then Rachel has some grandchildren, and then one of her kids has a great-grandchild. So we see 4 generations. And it's funny, you're going to see this pattern of 4 generations in the Bible in numerous occasions. We're going to read about it today, but it's also a good way to think about evangelism, thinking about you lead someone to Jesus, who are they going to lead to Jesus? And then who will they lead to Jesus? So it's looking at generations. So let's look at that today in the Bible. Next slide. God's first command in the Bible was to be fruitful and multiply. And we know that's obviously speaking about physically, and we've done that. We have like 8 billion people on the planet. But the principle of multiplication is throughout anything that lives is meant to multiply. Next. In the early church, there was about 3,000 who were added in Acts 2, verse 41. But later on it says the number of disciples multiplied. How many of you know there's a difference between adding and multiplying? You know, 2 plus 5 is what? 2 times 5 is, so you understand there's a big difference between addition and multiplication. So addition eventually led to multiplication. But then on the next slide, you'll see that the multiplication of disciples actually ended up in the multiplication of churches. And it says the churches throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria were multiplied. So there's an idea of everything that God does is fruitful and multiplying. And it holds true for the salvation of people. Let's look at it in a few scriptures. Next verse. Here's the Great Commission. There's 4 generations listed here. So Jesus is generation number 1, right? He's the guy who started it. And Jesus said to them, that's the 12 or the 11 actually at that time, that's generation 2. And then he said, I want you to go make disciples. What generation would that be? That's the 3rd generation. So Jesus to his disciples, go make disciples. And then he said, teach them to obey everything I've commanded you. And how many of you know go and make disciples is one of the commands of Jesus? So it assumes there will be a 4th generation. So even in the Great Commission, we see 4 generations. Next, we see 4 generations when Paul spoke to Timothy about making disciples. He says, what you, Timothy, that's generation 2, have heard from me, that's Paul, generation 1, commit to, who's that? Faithful men. That's generation what? Who will be able to teach what? Others. That's generation what? 4. So 4 generations. Paul, Timothy, faithful men, others. And then next, even in the natural family, he commanded our fathers, that's generation 1, to teach their children. What generation's that? That's generation 2. That the next generation, what one's that? 3. The one that's not yet born, he says. So they can arise and tell their children. What generation's that? So there's 4 generations. So the Lord's always looking forward. Even here, I love this, the idea that God says, even those who aren't yet born, his heart is that they would be taught the ways of the Lord and they would not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. And then next slide, please. When we share the gospel with others and someone begins to follow Jesus, like Joe leads Mike to Jesus, it doesn't stop there. You know, Joe knows John and Jane. Maybe he can lead them to Jesus. And John and Jane know Jack and Mary, and maybe they can lead them to Jesus. So I'm looking here at Nora and Amy. There's a generation 1, a generation 2, right? So now here's the question. Who's generation 3? Yep. And who's generation 4? Whoever they bring. That's right. And so you've been generation 2. Now be fruitful and multiply. And that goes for every one of us. Some of you, actually every one of us is probably at least a generation 2. Somebody came and told you about Jesus. Let's find generation 3. And then when they come to Jesus, help them find generation 4. And it continues on and on. Next, how does multiplication begin? Teach new disciples that they are called to reproduce. Amy, you are called to reproduce. I'm going to pick on you today, all right? Train them in a tool for sharing the Gospels. Nora, show her how to do the 3 circles. All right. Pray for people that they know who are far from God. Amy, do you know some people who are far from God? Make a list. Begin to pray for them, that God can bring them to follow Jesus. And then someday you'll have the opportunity to share the good news with them and see generation 3. That'd be awesome. Amen? It's very simple.